The greatest question in the Bible is this: what will you do with Jesus, who is called the Christ?
That is the premiere, that Jerusalem has been reunited to Israel.
For over 60 years, this man stood at the pulpit and told the world exactly what God was saying. He predicted wars. He named nations. He declared the end of days with absolute certainty. Millions believed every word. Then something happened that nobody expected. At 85 years old, after surviving a near-death hospitalization, John Hagee said something that stopped his entire congregation cold, and it changed everything. The most honest sermon he ever preached. Scholars who have studied Hagee's theology for decades have noted something that quietly unsettles the official story. He began his ministry firmly inside dispensational theology, the belief system that reads the book of Revelation as a literal roadmap and places the modern state of Israel at the center of God's prophetic plan. That framework produced the blood moon predictions, the Jerusalem countdown prophecies, and the declarations about Iran that drew both global attention and global ridicule when the deadlines passed without incident. When John Hagee's ministry celebrated his 67th anniversary in April of 2025, the events in Jerusalem were as revealing as anything back at Cornerstone Church in San Antonio. He received the Support of Israel Award at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. He was honored at the Jerusalem Great Synagogue. Malcolm Hohenlein of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations said plainly that most people do not understand what John Hagee has actually done for the Jewish people. He called it a mission to improve the world, but his critics were just as firm.
The Three Heavens, this book that we've been offering you all month by John Hagee.
They saw a man who had used Israel as a theological vehicle for end times beliefs that ultimately served Christian eschatological interests more than Jewish ones. They saw a man who preached family values from behind a marriage history that required a public confession of immorality to survive. They saw a man whose personal compensation from ministry organizations exceeded $1 million a year while he asked his congregation to give sacrificially. Both portraits contain verified facts. Neither one is complete. And that is exactly the problem with every conversation about John Hagee. People pick a side and stop looking. But the real story is not in the side you pick. It is easy to preach when you are healthy, when your church is growing, when senators are returning your calls and cameras are on. The real sermon is the one you preach when you are sitting in a hospital bed at 80 years old, wondering whether you will ever stand at that pulpit again. John Hagee stood up. He came back. He sat in a chair and told his congregation the truth. Not the triumphant truth he had delivered for 6 decades. The quieter truth. The kind that costs something to say out loud. And that might be the most significant moment of his entire ministry. To understand why, you have to go back to the beginning. The Sunday everything shifted, John Hagee was not just a preacher. For decades, he was a certainty machine. Every Sunday morning, tens of thousands of people in San Antonio and millions more watching on television around the world tuned in not to wonder what he was going to say, but because they already knew. He was going to tell them exactly what the Bible says, exactly what is happening in the world, and exactly where it is all heading. That was the deal. That was the contract between John Hagee and his audience. So when he stepped to the pulpit and his tone was different, people noticed immediately. The commanding voice was still there. But something behind it had changed. He spoke slowly. He said he had spent his entire life studying Scripture and trying to explain every detail of God's plan. Then he paused. And he said something that a man like John Hagee is not supposed to say. He said that sometimes faith is not about having the answers. Sometimes it is about trusting God with the questions you cannot answer. The sanctuary went quiet. One longtime member described it this way: She said she had been coming to Cornerstone Church for over 20 years.
And then, as if she had awakened from a stupor, she looked at me and said, "What am I doing down here?"
She had watched this man declare nuclear wars, name the Antichrist, and tell her exactly what prophecy meant in every single headline. And now here he was saying he did not have all the answers. She said it was the first time she had ever felt like he was talking to her as a human being instead of teaching her like a student. But not everyone felt that way. Some members were unsettled. One congregant said plainly that they came to Cornerstone because it gave them clarity when the world felt chaotic. And now the man who was supposed to provide that clarity was asking them to sit with uncertainty instead. That felt, in his words, like the ground had moved. What made this moment so significant was not just what Hagee said. It was everything that had happened to him in the years before he said it. In October of 2020, John Hagee contracted COVID-19 and was hospitalized for 15 days with double pneumonia. He was 80 years old. His son Matt announced the diagnosis during a Sunday service while his father lay in a hospital bed. Benjamin Netanyahu personally tweeted his prayers, saying Israel had no better friend. When Hagee finally returned to Cornerstone, he did not stand at the pulpit. He sat in a chair. And he said something that had never come from his mouth quite like that before. He said he was sitting in that chair as a testimonial to the healing power of God. Not a triumphant declaration, a testimony of survival. Before that, in 2008, he had undergone quadruple bypass open heart surgery. Before that came a diagnosis of myasthenia gravis, a serious neuromuscular disease that attacked the very instrument he needed most as a preacher: his voice. This is the angle that almost nobody talks about when they discuss John Hagee. The man who spent 60 years telling other people how to face death had to face it himself, multiple times. And each time, something in him shifted just a little further from certainty and just a little closer to something quieter. Something that looked, to those paying close attention, a lot like humility. To understand why that shift at the pulpit was so stunning, you need to understand where this man came from. Because John Hagee was not supposed to be a pastor, the boy who almost went to West Point. He was born on April 12, 1940, in Baytown, Texas, in a home that had no television. Instead, the family sat on the front porch in the evenings and played music. His father played guitar. His mother played piano, organ, and accordion. Young John played saxophone. This was a fifth-generation pastor family, which means ministry had been in the Hagee blood for over a century before John was born. But John Hagee, the teenager, wanted nothing to do with church. He was the captain of his high school football team. He was a four-sport letterman. He made the National Honor Society. He won the American Legion Award for the most outstanding student in his graduating class. He was planning a military career, and he had the backing for it. Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who would later become President of the United States,
Far from the window where I sit with the problems of our country,
personally arranged a West Point appointment for him. That was the plan. John Hagee was going to be a soldier, not a preacher. Then came the last Sunday of January in 1958. He was 17 years old and sitting inside a revival at his father's church, which he attended only because his parents made him. Something happened that night that he has struggled to fully explain in words ever since. He went to the front of the church and prayed what he describes as the most honest prayer of his life. He told God that if there were other plans for his life, God needed to remove his desire to go to West Point. He said he kept the prayer short because he meant every word of it. Within days, the West Point appointment was gone, not because it was rescinded, because John Hagee no longer wanted it. 10 days later, he enrolled at Southwestern Assemblies of God University. Before his 18th birthday, he preached his first sermon. He titled it, "The Place Called Calvary," from Luke chapter 23. He later said he never looked back, not once. He went on to earn a Bachelor of Science from Trinity University in San Antonio on a football scholarship, and later a master's degree in educational administration from the University of North Texas. He understood even then that communicating truth poorly was a form of dishonoring truth. He studied not to replace his faith, but to make it sharper. So when someone like John Hagee admits he does not have all the answers, it costs him something real. Building an empire on concrete and conviction. In October of 1966, John Hagee started a church in San Antonio with almost no money and no track record. He qualified for $65,000 in bonds because a college classmate happened to work at the issuing bank. There was not enough left after buying the property to construct a building. The congregation rented a storefront. Then they worshiped in a chapel at Trinity University. Every offering went toward building materials. The men of the church worked on construction every night except Wednesday. The first official Sunday service was held on a bare concrete slab. There was an organ, a piano, a roof, and exposed wooden studs. It was winter. You could see people's breath. John Hagee preached anyway. For his first 3 years as a pastor, he lived on $7,000 a year. His parsonage was a garage. This is the origin story that the television ministry and the megachurch and the political influence tend to obscure. John Hagee was not handed a platform. He poured concrete for it. By 1987, he dedicated Cornerstone Church, a 5,000-seat sanctuary on Stone Oak Parkway in northeast San Antonio. People called it Vatican II because nothing that large had ever been built in that part of the city before. The press thought it would fail. On dedication morning, over 6,000 people showed up. His aging father, who had spent his life pastoring small Assemblies of God churches across Texas, delivered the dedication prayer. The growth from there was relentless. Cornerstone became one of the largest congregations in the United States, eventually reaching more than 22,000 active members. John Hagee Ministries broadcasts on approximately 160 television stations and 50 radio stations, reaching an estimated 99 million homes. His programs aired in over 200 nations. He wrote more than 40 books. 7 of them reached the New York Times bestseller list. And then there was Christians United for Israel, which he founded on February 7, 2006. It began with 400 evangelical pastors gathered at Cornerstone Church. Within 12 years, it had grown to 5 million members. Today, it claims over 10 million members, making it the largest pro-Israel organization in the United States, larger even than IPAC. It helped pass legislation in 34 states and drove over 135,000 emails to the White House in support of moving the American Embassy to Jerusalem. On May 14, 2018, John Hagee stood at the opening ceremony of the American Embassy in Jerusalem and delivered the closing benediction. He had met every Israeli prime minister since Menachem Begin. He had known Benjamin Netanyahu personally since 1985. His annual Night to Honor Israel had raised over $100 million for Israeli and Jewish causes. But that kind of power comes with a very specific kind of shadow. Then came the turning point of his life, the fire that burned everyone it touched. In 2006, he published Jerusalem Countdown, which predicted that Iran would obtain nuclear weapons by October of that same year and trigger a conflict prophesied in Scripture. The deadline came and went. The war did not happen. Hagee never formally retracted the timeline. He simply moved forward. Then came the blood moon predictions. In 2013, he published 4 blood moons, which declared that 4 consecutive total lunar eclipses falling on Jewish holidays in 2014 and 2015 would herald world-changing prophetic events related to Israel. The eclipses passed without prophetic fulfillment. 3 of the 4 were not even visible from Israel. Theologians and scholars publicly criticized the claims. Hagee never issued a public apology for the failed predictions. He moved forward again. In May of 2008, the campaign of Senator John McCain discovered what supporting John Hagee actually cost. McCain had accepted Hagee's endorsement in February of that year. Then audio surfaced of a sermon Hagee had delivered in the late 1990s in which he described Adolf Hitler as a hunter sent by God to drive Jewish people back to the land of Israel. He based this on a passage from the book of Jeremiah. He said it was not his interpretation, but God's. The Jewish community was outraged. Holocaust scholars were outraged. The ADL condemned the remarks. McCain's campaign was in crisis. Within days, McCain publicly rejected Hagee's endorsement, calling the statement crazy and unacceptable. Within 30 minutes of McCain's statement, Hagee withdrew the endorsement himself, saying he was tired of the attacks. Hagee then issued a written apology to Jewish leaders. The ADL accepted it. Some Orthodox rabbis defended him, saying his interpretation was not far from certain traditional Jewish texts, but the damage to his political reputation was severe and lasting. This was not the only fire. He had built a years-long record of statements comparing the Roman Catholic Church to the whore of Babylon described in the Book of Revelation. He had declared that Hurricane Katrina was God's judgment on New Orleans because the city had been planning a gay pride parade. He had consistently declared that same-sex marriage would lead God to judge America the way he judged Sodom and Gomorrah. That tension has never been fully resolved, and it may be exactly what makes the shift in his later years so personally costly and so publicly significant. The collapse behind the pulpit. In 1975, John Hagee stood before the congregation of Trinity Church in San Antonio and delivered a letter of confession. He admitted publicly that he was guilty of immorality. He did not use more specific language than that in public documents, but the circumstances told their own story. He was in the final year of a marriage to his first wife, Martha Downing, with whom he had 2 children, and within months of that confession, he married Diana Castro, a woman who had been a member of his own congregation at Trinity Church. The backlash was immediate and brutal. This was a conservative evangelical church community in 1975 Texas. Divorce was not just personally painful, it was professionally catastrophic. Pastors did not survive this. Members of his own congregation turned against him. His credibility collapsed. His ministry at Trinity Church was finished. He was 35 years old. He had built something, and he watched it dissolve because of his own choices. Diana Castro became far more than a second wife. She sold a farm with him so they could buy television cameras when the church board refused to fund the broadcast ministry. She co-directed Christians United for Israel. She wrote books. She organized women's ministries. She became the infrastructure of everything John built after the collapse of everything that came before. He has said in interviews that the trials he survived taught him 3 things: patience, humility, and the understanding that faith is not about having every answer. It is about trusting God when there is no clear path forward. Those words hit differently when you know the full story of where he was standing when he first had to believe them. What happens when the prophet has to trust? John Hagee spent 60 years telling his audience to trust God. Then life put him in a position where he had to do it himself in ways he had never anticipated. The quadruple bypass in 2008. Myasthenia gravis attacking his voice. The 15 days in the hospital with double pneumonia in the fall of 2020. when his son had to take the pulpit and tell the congregation that the man who was always supposed to be strong enough to stand there was lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life. When Netanyahu publicly prayed for his recovery, there was something almost cinematic about the image. The man who had dedicated decades to standing up for Israel in the American political arena was now receiving prayers from the Israeli Prime Minister while battling a disease in a San Antonio hospital room. He came back changed, not quieter in terms of conviction, but different in tone. The triumphalism softened. The relentless certainty that had characterized his earlier ministry gave way to something more like testimony. He did not stand at the pulpit when he returned. He sat in a chair. And he said something that a survivor says, not something that a prophet announces. He said he was sitting in that chair as proof that God still heals. Not a declaration, a witness statement. And at 85 years old, still preaching and still standing, he is both the man his critics describe and the man his supporters defend. He is a builder and a divider, a prophet and a survivor, a man who preached certainty to the world and then had to learn, in the most painful and private ways possible, what it actually means to trust when you are not certain at all. What do you think? Was the quieter Hagee the real one all along, or did life simply wear down the certainty he built everything on? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.